Hello all. Today we are talking about the Reformation. Ever since Christianity entered the picture, the church struggled with problems of establishing dogma, with defining precisely what it was to be Orthodox, small o. And movements have emerged throughout that found themselves both within and without the bounds of Orthodox Christianity. Movements that were deemed out of bounds included, from Rome's perspective, the Coptics, Gnostics, Donatism, Arianism, Cathars, Valdensians, and other heresies as well. If you'll recall, the Inquisition became an institution, a panel of an investigation to determine if heresy had been committed. In the 12th century, this was a temporary institution in response to particular problems such as the Albigensians in southern France. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, however, if you'll recall, made it a formal permanent institution in Canon 3 on heresy. The Inquisition becomes permanent. During most of the Middle Ages, inquisitorial process and outcomes were generally relatively mild. Perhaps you'd have a heavy penance, maybe something public. You'd be forbidden from receiving the Eucharist until you had fulfilled that penance. In the early modern period, the Inquisition becomes harsher and more aggressive. Part of the reason for that has to do with a slew of other changes, and some of it emerges around anxiety about Jews. For example, the Inquisition is as fierce as any place in Spain, where its motivations and practices weren't really so dedicated to routing out heresy, that is, wrong belief, as it was to routing out insincere conversions to Christianity. So routing out converso Jews in this place where there was a greater degree of interaction between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. This anxiety well, let me not talk too much about Spain right now, although I'd like to, but let me just say at some level there was a degree of paranoia and atrocious persecution, but it wasn't just paranoia. For example, one historian tells the story of a Jewish family in Amsterdam where the father and the family had moved to Amsterdam, which was a place of relative freedom in the 16th century. And the father had two of his sons circumcised, but a third son who did business in Catholic Spain didn't get circumcised. The logic being that it was too dangerous. If he were to be caught and questioned about his true faith, he didn't want to be unmasked by his circumcision, which was a practice associated with Jews, to be discovered. So at any rate, talking about, there were some people that were, some types of belief that were deemed ultimately out of bounds. And then there was also, if you'll recall, a degree of variation in belief that was deemed in bounds. And examples of those would be the Franciscans, these monks that instead of living away from the world in the cloister, decided to minister among people in urban places. We also mentioned the Beguines, a lay society of women. They didn't formally take orders. They didn't formally take, monastic orders, and yet they lived in these devotional communities. That was something unique, that atypical. So for all this variation, nonetheless, the story of Christendom has been in large part one of unity. From the 5th to the 12th century, Europe had been created and defined by conversion to Christendom and being part of a Christian society. In the 15th century, the area of what's considered Europe, and Europe isn't a highly developed concept at the time, let's say that in passing. But in the 15th century, what's Europe shrinks to some degree because of Turkish expansion into Southeast Europe. The Eastern Orthodox region, which already has separated theologically, despite some 15th century attempts, such as the Council of Florence in 1440, to reunite the churches, it's already separated, and with the Turkish incursions into Europe, the Orthodox Church is further isolated by those Ottoman advances. At any rate, so Christendom has taken some hits, has more or less remained one big thing. This is a map we would look at, and the purple is Christendom, the orange is Orthodoxy, the green is Islam. But the 16th century is going to change all that. The Reformation changes all that. Never again will we see one Christian faith in Western Europe. And it will be, and this Reformation will be accompanied and followed by numerous wars that destroy Christian unity, creating a fragmented religious landscape that obtains to this day. Now, and in this series of lectures, we're going to talk about the Reformation. My outline for discussing the Reformation is as following. We're going to talk about underlying causes, nature of the protests, Martin Luther. We're going to cover more perfunctorily wars of religion, the development of the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, and its legacy. I'll give more emphasis to the first half of our list than the latter half. And in addition to your text, two books that I'm drawing on in large part as I share, as I kind of tell you the story of the Reformation as I think should be told, one of the ways. I'm drawing on this book, Protestants, Birth of a Revolution by Stephen Osman, and also the German Reformation and the Peasants' War here in a list of documents, a kind of archive in your hand compiled by Michael Baylor. So with that, the Reformation. What makes things give now in the early 16th century? This period in which kings are getting more powerful, the economy is changing drastically, scientific reasoning is being articulated and becoming more widespread. Witchcraft trials however, simultaneously proliferating. So it's in this period that Martin Luther will unleash the Reformation with his 95 Theses in 1517. Now, the church had weathered dissent before, but this time the church doesn't weather the dissent successfully. Why? Well, I'd suggest to you that the Reformation and the fractures that result in Christendom illustrate and are a result of political concerns and social concerns and economic changes as much as they are of theological ones. And in laying the groundwork for the Reformation, I want to start broadly by revisiting medieval piety, so kind of the social cultural world, not just theological world that many Christian Europeans lived, in order to hopefully bring into relief a bit what is changing. And then we'll introduce the man credited with setting it all in motion, Martin Luther. So some preconditions for the Reformation. What's happening before? As you'll recall, church status is weakening. We talked about the crises of the papacy, including the Avignon papacy, including the Babylonian captivity and the Great Schism. All of these things do no favors for the church's Reformation reputation. And then we also talked about with the Renaissance, we have exposures like the donation of Constantine. I don't want to overplay the importance of of this one event, but just pointing out this revelation through deep textual study back to as part of this celebration of the ancients, where it was found out that the donation of Constantine, this justification for the papacy having these Western lands, had in fact been a forged document from the 8th century, that Constantine in the 300s never deeded these lands to the Pope, and it was the Renaissance scholar Lorenzo Valla who was able to expose this in 1440. So the church is taking some hits, but other concerns that hurt the church's reputation had to do with church abuses. And some of those included simony, the buying and selling of church offices, absenteeism, that sometimes you would have a bishop or some high church official who's receiving the entitlement, the income for an office, but he's not physically present there because he's on some other estate. Maybe he is holding more than one office at a time. That was referred to as pluralism, holding multiple offices simultaneously. How could you, in the age before Zoom, really care for two parishes simultaneously? Nepotism, the advancing of a family member just because they're a family member, was also seen as a bit of a problem. Although, to be fair, in the pre-modern world, it isn't nearly the clear problem that it is once you have notions like the consent of the governed and tax budgets that are accountable to the people. At any rate, and then there's also this concern about the immorality of the church. And there's immorality to talk about. Let me give you one notorious example, is actually an example right at the top. The Borgia Pope, Alexander VI, and this is an image of him there, and he is the Pope from 1492 to 1503. He is kind of exhibit A in all kinds of corruption that a Pope should not be condoning, let alone living at all. He married his daughter La Sergia to 3 of Italy's rulers. He carved out a state for his son Cesare in Romagna, in whose court Leonardo da Vinci worked for a time. And so as far as kind of the church being an institution to focus on people's souls and help them move towards salvation in another life, having armies and being in the thick of politics is hardly kind of leading the church in the ways that a church leader should. He's not the only one, but popes and other high clerics engage in all kinds of things that are seen as immoral by church theology. They have concubines, they have courtesans, prostituted boys are found at the court in Rome. In 1491, the secretary from the German city of Augsburg, he wrote ominously after his visit to Rome. He penned this, quote, "I see that everything here can be bought from top to bottom. Intrigues, hypocrisy, adulation are highly honored. Religion is debased. Righteousness sleeps." And yes, there's a sign that when in Rome, but it's not like this stuff went without mention in Italy either. And here is, let me tell you a little bit about this man. Girolamo Savonarola was someone who objected. Savonarola was a Dominican friar who denounced the clerical corruption that he saw around him. He denounced despotic rule. He denounced exploitation of the poor. And in 1494, with the help of the invading French King Charles VIII, this is all much more complicated, but the ruling Medicis were ousted from Florence, kind of the heart of the Renaissance, and a popular republic was established with Savonarola at the head. And he was going to turn things around, promoting a vision of Florence as a new Christian Jerusalem. He initiated a campaign that we would anachronistically call puritanical. There's no Puritans yet. We're still in the late 15th century. But he, among other things, he's trying to impose a strict moral code. He held bonfires of the vanities. Before it was a Michael Douglas film, it was the practice of having a bonfire and throwing into it things that encouraged sin, cosmetics, novels, those sorts of indulgences. Well, no surprise, the population of Florence quite quickly soured on Savonarola's strictness. The Pope too, Alexander VI, we just talked about him, he wasn't pleased either, and he found grounds to excommunicate him in 1497. And in 1494, a kind of community clerical joint effort saw Savonarola deposed, condemned, hanged, and burned in Florence's main square. But so that was an example from the Borgia Pope Alexander VI. There's another example of high-level church corruption, but perhaps more significant than high-level corruption and abuses by the Pope in Rome, whom few in Christendom ever encountered personally, were perceived abuses at the local parish level. There was this sense that the priests and clergy were, well, uneducated for one, and that is part of what those Gregorian reforms were a lot about. If we're going to really lead, we need to know the doctrine, know what we're talking about, get priests educated. So there've been some successes in that effort, to be sure, but there's still a perception that your local priest just isn't quite up to the measure. So perhaps undereducated, but also immoral. Their priests are notorious for drunkenness, and which isn't wholly bad, right? The excess is what's bad, but that's only part of it. There's also kind of more serious concerns that monks are immoral in other ways. Here is a pretty famous woodcut from 1523 of a monk who seduces a maiden and then seeks to pay off the father for his daughter's concubinage. You see him reaching for coins on the table there. This woodcut, by the way, was done by an artist, Leonard Beck, who would also spend part of his time being an assistant to Hans Holbein, the artist who painted the most famous portraits of King Henry VIII of England. Here is an earlier manuscript detail of from a 14th century manuscript of a friar grabbing a maiden in her private parts. And these are examples of this concern that that at the local level, the priesthood isn't really isn't really living the standard to be able to lead the flock. And now we kind of get into this idea of late medieval piety. One can ask the questions, and historians have asked, is the level of abuse in the church changing? Is it on the rise? Or is it something else? Is the population changing? Is it that people are more urban, more educated, more demanding of their faith leaders to walk the walk and talk the talk? Is there an increase in popular piety? For example, think of the donation of Constantine. This really makes a splash among literati. An ignorant peasant isn't going to get us this expose, but that there's a crowd to really react to this sort of information and knowledge kind of says that maybe it isn't just the church leaders that are changing, but the led as well are changing. And now I want to make a few comments about late medieval piety. Like, for example, relics, which have been around for a long time. We talked about relics before, and icons, etc., relics are perceived by many, early modern faithful as being a real problem, that there's too much emphasis on relics. If you'll recall, as Christianity had developed, saints became an important part of Christian cosmology. And on the coattails of saint veneration came relics. Their body parts became like a derivative, became very blessed, and it was wonderful. Every church worth its salt or Holy Spring wanted to have some relics to attract a crowd. And there even arose a veritable a derivative market that around relics, as they were traded and stolen from each other. It started with Jesus tokens, but the market showed such potential that it quickly expanded. I'm being a little bit flip here, but the worship, or not worship, right? It's veneration. So I'm not worshiping this directly. I'm just recognizing it as a vehicle that helps me get closer to the grace of God. Some people thought that was maybe a little too much hair splitting. But at any rate, this or that thing, that an object that had to do with Christ, Mary's veil, a piece of the true cross, the cloth that had wiped Jesus's face at his death, which is known as the Shroud of Turin, milk from Mary's breast, all of these things became staples of medieval Christian relics. The Holy Grail, Jesus's chalice at the Last Supper, is of course the ever elusive Alpha and Omega in the relic world, but there were other biggies as well. Jesus's foreskin, for example, the Holy Prepuce was reportedly the treasure in over a dozen medieval churches, as were vials of Jesus's blood, his baby teeth. The church has managed to save itself from the embarrassment of any earthly holy places boasting his actual adult body parts. That would really undermine that whole ascension argument. But other saints' body parts have more than made up for it. Saints were considered holy as well, that their bodies didn't decay. Miracles were reported by those who touched or were near them. Maybe they gave off an aroma that was pleasing and considered sacred. So any little backwater medieval parish really bolstered its credibility and prestige by having relics on hand. No pun intended, because sometimes, as you see here in this reliquary, they were indeed hands. And as I said, so thus springs up this entire relic market, fueled no doubt by piety, but also by a certain profit sense and religious fervor. Pilgrimages became a part of this. If you couldn't go all the way to the Holy Land, there were places in Christendom that you could go as well, discount pilgrimage, so to speak. Come hither, see Saint so-and-so's healing finger or bits of the true cross. And bits of the true cross, on which Jesus was crucified by the Romans, for those not reared in the New Testament. And so much of the true cross was dispersed in churches throughout Europe that, as one critic put it, it could have rebuilt Noah's Ark twice over. And the fact that body parts tended to be standard distribution packages presented unique opportunities. Bones and fingers abounded most commonly, but the stalwart faithful hadn't shied away from soft tissue relics as well. The brain of St. Peter, occasional other fleshy bits. With all the credibility and economic profit that accompanied a good relic collection, not to mention medieval authentication standards that quite literally lacked, it comes as no surprise that lots and lots of relics popped up around Europe. 3 heads of St. John the Baptist, multiple foreskins of Jesus to repeat, and lots of bones and fingers. The 16th century Protestant reformer John Calvin commented that if all the relics were brought together in one place, quote, it would be manifest that every apostle has more than 4 bodies and every saint 2 or 3. So that remark kind of shows you the new criticism that is emerging among a more urban, educated Christian flock who aren't as satisfied with these previous practices of piety. And so it's easy to make fun of relics, as Martin Luther, whom we'll talk about, did in his lectures at the University of Wittenberg. But I do want to point out one of, for me at least, history's greatest ironies before proceeding is that, and this is a little bit of a spoiler alert, this is a picture of a portrait of Frederick III, or also known as Frederick the Wise, painted by one of the famous artists of the 16th century. And Frederick the Wise became Martin Luther's protector and patron. Frederick the Wise himself had a collection of 17,443 relics when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door in 1595, and that collection grew to just over 19,000 relics when he stopped displaying it in 1522. His collection included straw from Jesus's manger, 35 fragments of wood from the true cross, and the thumb of Saint Anne, Mary's mother. So I think it's kind of just an ironic note to share with you that that Frederick the Wise, protector of Martin Luther, nonetheless very much engaged in the kind of relic venerating piety that Martin Luther took tremendous issue with. But let's refocus back to this broader issue of medieval piety. There's this idea writ large in medieval piety of intercession. Saints are kin. They are the remnants, can intercede on our behalf. It's kind of taking social norms that, can you speak for this person? Can you stand in for this person? Can you talk to his reputation or her reputation? The sort of community, the links that bound communities together in normal social practice, this extends to the other world. And so there's this sense that saints can intercede on our behalf, just as kin in life would represent us. And relics, masses for the dead, All Souls Day are all manifestations of that sort of folkloric sense of intercession. And another sense of that, I'll try and make this case to you, is our indulgences, which I'll talk about in a moment. So, yeah, this sort of piety that's sort of steeped in these older ways of human societies interacting with each other, intercession, satisfaction, kinship bonds. It sort of extends to the theology at some level in these sorts of practices that we might group under intercession. And indulgences are another example of that. So what exactly is an indulgence? Around the 12th century, here is a picture of an indulgence. And in here is the place where you could write in the person's name. When printing presses, these were written by hand. And then when printing presses came along, they came off printing presses as well. And you could just leave a blank and write in the name of whosoever purchased that indulgence, or in whose name it was purchased. Around the 12th century, Catholic theology increasingly emphasized the idea of purgatory as a halfway house between heaven and hell. It was a vague concept that became and remains part of accepted doctrine. Church fathers found justification for the idea in Corinthians, at the Council of Florence in 1439-40, in the important Counter-Reformation Council of Trent, in 1563, the church makes statements on purgatory, the sense that someone is not condemned to hell, but hadn't quite earned heaven yet, and had to be put in some more time being alienated from God before being worthy of the eternal reward of heaven. Originally, the sense of purgatory was neutral. It was just separation. By the 15th century, the sense of purgatory had acquired connotations that one suffered in purgatory. It wasn't neutral. So time in purgatory, an idea emerged, could be shortened by the actions of the living, such as arranging for memorial masses, saying prayers for the dead, and indulgences start to get this sort of a currency as well. According to church theology, the church has the authority to grant sinners remission of penalties for sin by drawing on what was termed a treasury of merits. People thought of it as a sort of strongbox, like those in which merchants carried their coins. An indulgence was a piece of parchment, done from animal skin, and later paper, signed by a high church official that substituted a virtuous act from the treasury of merit for penance. The papacy and bishops had given crusaders such indulgences, and by the later Middle Ages, indulgences were offered for making pilgrimages or other pious activities, and sold outright. People widely believed, now this wasn't true to the strictest theology, but people widely believed that indulgences secured total remission of penalties for sin and could substitute both for penance and for time in purgatory. This idea was a major concern for Martin Luther. And we'll put this in the category of short-term causes, and we'll come back to this in a moment. But there's much more, but I want to kind of put this reaction and sense of indulgences under this category of kind of late medieval piety and how it might be changing as underlying longer term causes or context that contributes to the Reformation. Martin Luther isn't the only one who was critical of indulgences. These ideas are widespread, and they are very kind of standard critiques among humanists, and especially among Northern humanists. Here's a picture of Martin Luther. We'll come back to him. We'll talk about him more. And here is just a slide kind of reiterating some of the questions I've been asking. What's changing? Are church abuses on the rise, or is culture changing? The world is becoming more urban, more educated. There's more emphasis on individualism, and the Northern Renaissance has an even stronger emphasis on piety than in the South. Recall that in the South, which we focused on in our lecture on the Renaissances, the manifestation of humanism was very much artistic and cultural. It went from the page to the canvas to public spaces, and we talked about art and patronage largely. Well, in the North, the Northern Renaissance had a different sort of flavor. They were both based in humanism, very much based in humanism. But in the North, there was an even stronger emphasis on piety. So if in the South we had this tremendous cultural production, and there I couldn't resist this 2020 variation of Corona Lisa. What we really mean is the Mona Lisa, a portrait painted just shortly before the Reformation begins. This is from the Southern Renaissance, but here's a little bit of Northern art, and it does produce Northern art. Here is Van Eyck's painting of the Arnolfini wedding, a 15th century painting. Here is a painting by Quentin Massey's, The Moneylender and His Wife, a remarkable painting. Not only is this not of a religious context, this is like a moneylender and his wife at home accounting money, which is taking on a subject that was rarely a favorable or positive subject in painting, and now making a portrait of it. So this is a painting quite indicative of a changing world. So these are two examples that I just showed you of artwork from the Northern Renaissance. There are also authors, Geoffrey Chaucer, the English poet who wrote Canterbury Tales. We might see him as a cultural figure of the Northern Renaissance. By the way, he has a section that rails against the relic trade that I could have shared with you. William Shakespeare of the 16th century writer is another, we might, Renaissance figure, probably the most famous figure of the Northern Renaissance. But in general, if I was going to generalize, I would say that yes, we have these cultural figures, this patronage, the artwork, the literary accomplishments, but in large part in the North, the Renaissance is more focused on piety. Perhaps the smaller, more urban city-state dynamic of the Italian peninsula, with its greater number of players, lent itself more to that public competitive patronage through arts and visuals. But in the North, there's more of a focus on faith and piety. Yes, they look back to the ancient world, but instead of reading the classical pagan authors so much, they're reading the church fathers more, Jerome, Augustine. And one of the most famous, I probably think when I think Northern Shakespeare is, let's just say he's in a class all his own, perhaps, but one of the most famous figures of the Northern Renaissance as such is probably Desiderius Erasmus, who lives from 1469 to 1536. Thomas More, Martin Luther, also very important figures. Now, Erasmus, whose portrait is right here, he was born in Rotterdam in Netherlands, which is emerging as a quite vibrant economy, even as it has wages war against Spain for a long time. Erasmus preached a simple piety. He was one of his most famous texts is the Handbook of the Christian Soldier, which he wrote in the early 1500s. In 1511, he wrote a text called In Praise of Folly, which was a satire. And if you and I were to read it, we probably wouldn't think it was all that funny, but people at the time saw it as really funny. He had a biting humor to him. But he also engaged in quite serious scholarly work. And one of his contributions to the literary world was that he published an annotated New Testament translation in Latin from the Greek. And this is very much a humanist act, right? Going back to an ancient text, translating it into Latin. He was quite critical of the church, but for all his criticism, he remained Catholic. And he was, in many ways, his writings inspired Martin Luther and provoked Martin Luther into taking his ideas where they would. But for whatever kind of fellow traveling that they experienced in their criticism of the church, the two never actually met, but knew of each other. Later, Erasmus would distance himself from Luther when when the project became more about not reforming the church from within, not improving the church and eradicating its abuses, righting its wrong, but about starting a whole new church. At that point, the moderate Erasmus kind of stayed with the faith. He was a rare example of moderation in an increasingly polarized period, but I can't let him off the hook with that final note. I don't want you to get the idea he's all about moderation. Or Erasmus wrote, I want to share with you an example of Erasmus thinking in a letter he wrote to a German scholar. And this gets at, I think, the widespread anti-Semitism that we observe. And this is what he wrote, quote, "One doubt still possessed my mind. I am afraid that, under cover of a revival of ancient literature, paganism may attempt to rear its head, as there are some among Christians that acknowledge Christ in name, but breathe inwardly a heathen spirit. Or, on the other hand, that the restoration of Hebrew learning may give occasion to a revival of Judaism. This would be a plague as much opposed to the doctrine of Christ as anything that could happen. Some books have lately come out with a strong flavor of Judaism. I see how Paul exerted himself to defend Christ against Judaism, and I am aware that some persons are secretly sliding in that direction. So that's just a little bit about Erasmus, and we've spent some time kind of looking at late medieval piety and how it might not be such a fit for a more urban, educated flock in the early modern period. We'll end on that, and the next time we'll talk about Martin Luther and the firestorm that he started.